Hi, everybody. We're going to try something new here. A first ever live stream on this channel. This is a quick response to yesterday's decision by Major League Baseball to posthumously reinstate 17 former players from the permanently ineligible list. Because if they're posthumous, they're no longer with us. My name is Ken Tomash. Thank you for watching tonight. The decision yesterday had major implications for a pair of great hitters. Pete Rose is one, but he will not be the topic of this discussion because my guest tonight is an expert on the other one. He is that expert, in fact, is Jacob Pomrenke of the Society for American Baseball Research and editor of Scandal on the South Side, the 1919 Chicago White Sox, the definitive research work on the Black Sox. If your working knowledge of this scandal is 8 men out, it's okay, but you're just a little bit behind it. The scandal itself is subject for another day, but today we're going to talk about the great hitter in question as well as his teammates and how yesterday's decision impacts them. That hitter is one Joseph Walker Jackson, better known as Shoeless Joe Jackson. He's been ineligible since 1921 when Commissioner Landis banned him and the other 7 men who were part of the scheme to throw the World Series. Yesterday's ruling by Commissioner Rob Manfred seems to open the door for Jackson's potential enshrinement in the Hall of Fame, but does it? We will explore that over the next several minutes. We'll try to answer some of your questions, so put those in the chat as well. Jacob joins us from Chicago. Thanks, my friend. I appreciate you joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me on, Ken.
I know you are the guy when it comes to this topic, so I thought this is the guy we got to have. Again, put your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them after we grill Jacob for a few here. Did you or the folks at SABR have any inkling that this decision was coming or that it was coming yesterday?
No, this was quite a shock on a random Tuesday afternoon. You know, we certainly have been paying attention to the rumblings with the political climate earlier this year. Certainly, you know, President Trump's announcements and posts online have perked up my ears, you know, that something like this might be coming down the pike at some point. But we certainly had no idea it was coming this quickly or right now. This was all new to me for sure.
Let's talk about the decision itself for a minute, and credit where credit is due, because I can see baseball's rationale as they stated it, that a lifetime ban can end with the end of the lifetime, and it may be semantic, but it's not the lifetime ban list, it's the permanently ineligible list, and permanent has a definition, meaning leaving emotions out of it because baseball fans are very passionate about this issue. It seems like everyone is on board with this. How about you?
Well, you know, I think there is some legitimacy to the argument that, you know, Major League Baseball doesn't have jurisdiction over these players. And I do think there is a case to be made that you can separate the ineligibility of players to be employed by Major League Baseball versus their, you know, chances to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. I think those are two separate questions and two separate issues. However, you know, since 1991, those issues have been pretty intertwined, and, you know, where MLB goes, the Hall of Fame typically follows. So this is, you know, definitely a new chapter in that story. Whether or not it actually changes anything about Pete Rose or Shoeless Joe Jackson or anyone else remains to be seen.
Now, many people, obviously, especially those who maybe are not following it as closely as some others, may have said yesterday, "Oh, there's no question. This means immediate induction, and I'll turn on my Major League Baseball network in January, and I'll see that Rose and Jackson are inducted into the Hall of Fame, and that'll be that." But it's a little more complicated than that, and the Hall has clarified exactly why that is a little more complicated. Walk us through that real quick.
Yeah, this is not going to be automatic enshrinement for Pete Rose or Shoeless Joe Jackson by any means. The Hall of Fame said on Tuesday that the next chance that both Rose and Jackson or any other players who might be considered for the classic era ballot will be in December of 2027. So we're still about 2.5 years out from those deliberations for what used to be called the Veterans Committees. And then the class of 28 is when they would be eligible to be voted in. So we still have a long way to go. A lot can happen, certainly. And I don't think by any means that this is, you know, just because Major League Baseball has made this decision about their eligibility, I don't think by any means that makes it an automatic enshrinement for anybody.
We should note perhaps that in 1936 and 1946, Joe Jackson received 2 Hall of Fame votes in each of those years. In the latter instance, it was part of a 2-step process to determine the 20 players who would get on the ballot. And at that time, the Hall did not have the rule that they enacted in 1991, that anyone on the permanently ineligible list could not be on the ballot. Were those two votes still within the halo of the scandal, or did they reflect voters' attitudes about Jackson's worthiness as a Hall of Fame candidate? Do you have any idea about the climate at that time?
Yes, I think what it reflects most is the confusion that voters had around who was actually eligible for the Hall of Fame. The 5-year rule, you had to be retired for 5 years before you were eligible, was a rule that had not been enacted yet. In fact, that tripped up voters for Joe DiMaggio a few years later in the early 1950s. That's why he was not a quote unquote first ballot Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
So Joe received some votes in 1936 and in 1946, and mostly 1936 was, of course, the very first year that voters cast votes for the Hall of Fame, even though the Hall of Fame had not been open yet in Cooperstown. And so I think it was more a reflection that nobody quite knew who was eligible, how this thing was going to work. And Joe Jackson, obviously, if you're only looking at his on-field career, certainly deserves serious consideration for the Hall of Fame, and voters at that time would have believed the same. So I think that's more what those votes were about.
So let's talk about that for a second. His credentials: 356 lifetime average in 13 seasons, 4 seasons of 200 hits, another one where he just missed 200 hits during the dead ball era. Those are well known. Do you think those in and of themselves are enough to influence the people who will vote in December of 2027? Or have the legend and the mystique, which we'll get into more in a second, maybe buoyed him a little bit more than that? Because his career was cut short. And we don't have that kind of thing that they have in football, like the Terrell Davis or Gale Sayers, where someone can have a brilliant career for a short amount of time. I can't think of an analog in baseball, but do you think the mystique has buoyed him these last several years?
I think, Joe Jackson is at this point a mythological figure, not only in baseball, but also just in American culture.
Right.
And you can thank Hollywood for that. That's a, Field of Dreams creation. That's an 8 Men Out creation. He is now a mythological figure. The real Joe Jackson from Greenville, South Carolina, is almost unknown today. Nobody alive remembers seeing him play. Nobody remembers him, that much as a person later in life. So, what we're talking about is almost a ghost in a lot of ways, a baseball ghost. And you have to kind of strike through all of those myths to get to the real person and the real ball player. And the real Joe Jackson as a ball player was tremendous. I mean, he was known as one of the most natural hitters to ever live. That is still true today. We still, most people still believe that, and the numbers hold up very well even with modern analysis. He was a tremendous hitter, one of the greatest of his generation or of any generation. So I think if you only look at the on-field performance, Joe certainly has a very, very strong case to get in. Now, his counting stats are not great because, of course, his career ended at the age of 32 after the 1920 season, so he didn't get into the decline phase. He wasn't able to compile 2,000, let alone 3,000 hits, and so those numbers modern voters might look at and say, well, he wasn't on the field quite long enough. But when he was on the field, he was certainly a Hall of Fame player as we know it today.
And you mentioned how no one really knows him. Part of that was because he was a very private person after all this happened. I mean, he was not the kind who was out, the media was obviously very different, and he died many, many, many years ago, but he was not the type of guy who was out there. He wasn't signing autographs in Las Vegas or anything like that, like some other guys have done. He kept himself. Why do you think that was? And obviously that was part of the person that he was, but was he ashamed of the whole everything that happened, or what, that he just basically retired from public life?
I think that's one of the biggest myths about Shoeless Joe as a person, is that, he really left baseball, hung his head, and, never really resurfaced again. And the reality is, just like the other Black Sox players and the other band players in the 1920s, he kept on playing ball. He played independent baseball, semi-pro baseball, outlaw baseball all over the country, up into New York and Pennsylvania in the 1920s. So, he continued to play ball until he was, almost 50 years old. And he went back home to South Carolina and opened up a successful business, a liquor store and a restaurant and a dry cleaners. And so he and his wife, Katie, ran successful businesses in his hometown in South Carolina. And, he lived out his life. He went to the ballpark, the local ballpark, to watch the Greenville Spinners. He taught all the young kids in the neighborhood how to play ball. And so, he held his head up high. He didn't think he had anything to be ashamed of. He certainly believed that he had kind of gotten screwed out of his baseball career by Judge Landis and Charles Comiskey and others. But he held his head up high. He was a very proud man. He lived his life with his head up. And, he was very well respected and well loved in his hometown.
Now, there are a lot of guys who were, you got to understand the climate of the times, the late 19th century, early 20th century. There were a lot of gambling scandals. That's part of the reason that Landis was installed as commissioner. And it's part of the reason we have the rules that we have today. But and there are others like the Evangeline League scandal in the 40s and guys like that, the Ty Cobb Tris Speaker rumors that never panned out anything. But Tris Speaker wasn't banned, and quite frankly, nobody made 2 movies starring Tris Speaker, right? So that has elevated him from, like you said, a very, very good ball player and one of the best hitters ever into this kind of figure that maybe he can't do justice to because he's, at the end of the day, just a ball player, right?
Yeah, and one of the things about Shoeless Joe's story is that he is much more famous outside the Hall of Fame than he ever would have been if he had been inducted in, say, 1951 before he
Right.
died. If he gets inducted, in the late 1940s or early 1950s, he'd be Zach Wheat, he'd be Harry Heilman. Those guys were outstanding players, Hall of Fame players, who were contemporaries of Shoeless Joe, and no one today knows who they are. No one today remembers them or talks about them. Meanwhile, Shoeless Joe is in the news, every 5 minutes, and so is Pete Rose. So, this is something that Shoeless Joe, again, as more of a caricature rather than a ball player or a human being. But Shoeless Joe's story is well known. It's much more famous than he ever would have been if his career had just played out like normal. He had been inducted into the Hall of Fame, and nobody alive remembers him playing, and he gets forgotten.
Let's talk about the 1919 World Series now for a bit. Jackson hit 375 in that 8-game loss to the Cincinnati Reds, who are an underrated team. They obviously get caught up in this kind of scandal thing. People forget that they were a very good team as well. His advocates have said this was evidence that he wasn't actively trying to play poorly. That is worth noting, but he also did testify under oath that he took money from gamblers with the express purpose of throwing the World Series. A lot is made of his hitting in the series. You've done the research. How do you reconcile those two truths, and where do you land on his true culpability, if anywhere?
Well, I think there is no question. We have done the research. We have access to the trial transcripts. We have access to a lot of different legal documents here in Chicago at the History Museum and other places. Shoeless Joe took the money. There was absolutely no question about it. He accepted the bribe money from gamblers. He even complained under oath that he didn't get all the money he was promised. And then later on, he started changing his story and saying that he wasn't involved and he didn't take the money or anything else. But we know he took the money. We even know what he did with it. He paid off his younger sister's hospital bills in Savannah, Georgia. So this is something that we absolutely know to be true. He was involved in the scandal, in the fix. He did accept the bribe money. And for many people, that's enough. The fact that he took a bribe to lose the World Series, whether or not he played his best on the field, that's something we've been debating for 100 years, and we'll probably continue to debate for 100 more years. But he did take the money. There's absolutely no question about it. We have his own words under oath saying so, and including his wife, Katie, who testified during his civil trial. So we know for a fact that he was involved. He did take the money. He was guilty in that respect, and he certainly deserved some punishment, just like the other Black Sox.
And maybe the people who will vote will think that justice has already been served, and it's been long enough that's, it has happened before. We'll see. So obviously this decision also reinstated the other 7 players in this scandal, as well as 9 others who were in various degrees of infamy, shall we say. Now, the one of the Black Sox who perhaps has the best potential credentials is Eddie Cicotte. He won 209 games, 2.38 ERA, but there are a lot of guys with more than 209 wins who are not in the Hall of Fame. I mean, Bobo Newsom has more wins than that. Does Cicotte have any shot at all, do you think?
I don't think that Eddie Cicotte has a chance now in the 21st century. I do think that, again, just like Shoeless Joe, if his career had played out to its natural end instead of getting cut short after the 1920 season, I think if Cicotte had, continued to pitch well for 2, 3, 4 more years and
Mhm.
ended up closer to 250 career wins and a sparkling ERA. I absolutely think that he would have been inducted into the Hall of Fame a long time ago. He was certainly one of the best pitchers of his era, certainly got better as his career went on. He and Walter Johnson were basically 1-2 for those final, 4 or 5 years in the American League. And so I do think Cicotte does still, have an outside shot. His numbers look great, and his performance outside the 1919 World Series looks pretty good. But you can't overlook the fact that he fixed the World Series. So I think that's ultimately he is not going to get in. I don't really think he's got a realistic shot in the 21st century of ever reaching Cooperstown.
And he was 36 when his career ended. But in those days, obviously, he was still one of the guys who was allowed to throw the spitball, and he wasn't throwing 100 miles an hour. So he could potentially, as many guys did in those days, he could have pitched a few more years had that not happened. Now, the lively ball came in right after that as well. So that could have impacted him the other way. And one of those things that is unknowable, as many of these things are. Another guy we want to talk about, and I know he's near and dear to your heart because it's your handle on X, is Buck Weaver, a very good player who was on his way to becoming a terrific player. Now, I've always wondered, he was only 29 when his career ended because of the scandal. He's also a very sympathetic figure because he's got he only knew about it. He had knowledge of it, but he didn't take the money and all this, that. Again, you've done the research. What is, if any, is there evidence of Buck Weaver's culpability? And what do you think might have come of him had he not been banned and been able to play into his 30s or longer?
So the biggest black mark against Buck Weaver is that he participated in the meetings with the gamblers before and during the 1919 World Series. We have evidence and we have testimony from multiple Black Sox players placing Weaver in the hotel rooms and meeting up with the gamblers, both before the World Series and during. So, he did have some involvement. Now, there is a pretty universal consensus that Weaver did not accept any bribe money, at least during the 1919 World Series. However, there is pretty strong evidence that the White Sox continued to throw games during the 1920 season. And there are some people who do strongly believe that Buck Weaver was involved in some fixed games in the 1920 season. Now, whether or not he ever accepted any bribe money is very hard to say. There's not really any evidence for that or against that. But there is evidence that he was not playing very well down the stretch in the 1920 season, when we do know that the White Sox were continuing to throw games. So Weaver does have some culpability in that way. As for the Hall of Fame, he played only 9 seasons, so
Right.
technically he's not eligible. No matter what you believe about his involvement in the fix, he did not reach the 10-year mark. And, unlike Lou Gehrig or Roberto Clemente or Addy Joss or players like that, nobody's going to waive the 10-year rule or any other rule for Buck Weaver. His
Right.
numbers certainly do not warrant that. His sympathy, sympathy for his case. I know that he has a lot of supporters, including myself. And the Weaver family has been fighting for many years to get his name cleared, but I do not believe that Hall of Fame is in his future.
A reminder that the 1920 season went on, and the scandal did not break until very late that season, when all those guys then did get spent at the end of the 1920 season. Again, Buck Weaver was only 29 years old. I've always thought he might have been a potential manager of the White Sox later in his career had none of this happened. I mean, he was that type of player, and certainly in the period before Al Lopez came in, the White Sox were not very good after this. So that potentially could have been a thing that happened. Let me ask you this now. Obviously, we've talked about it's going to be 2.5 years plus before anyone sits down and starts to really take a look at these 17 players, which includes Pete Rose and Shoeless Joe Jackson, and for all we know, Eddie Cicotte. We don't think so. What do you suspect might happen? And what do you suspect we're going to hear about for those next couple of years and a half? I mean, this debate has not abated in the last 100 years, and I don't think it will really abate. If anything, it's as we get closer, it seems like it's only going to build to a crescendo. What's your take on what's going to happen between now and then, and what might happen in 2027?
Yeah, so, as I've said many times, the Black Sox scandal is a cold case, not a closed case. We are
Right.
continuing to learn more about the people involved, about the scandal, about the World Series, and I expect that to continue. This is something we've been debating for over 100 years now, and we'll continue to be debating. And I think, the next 2 years, we don't know what new information may come to light, what new research may be out there. I do not believe there's going to be any, major smoking gun that's going to exonerate Shoeless Joe or Buck Weaver or anybody else. But this is something that we're going to continue to learn about and talk about. Now, as far as the 2027 meeting of the Classic Era Committee, it really depends on the makeup of that committee. Typically, these veteran committees for the Hall of Fame include a couple Hall of Famers, players and executives, plus some media members and some historians and writers. So it really depends on the makeup of the Hall of Fame as to whether or not they will seriously consider Pete Rose or Shoeless Joe. I don't believe any of the other players listed in the announcement will be included on the ballot, but I do believe that both Rose and Jackson will be on the ballot. I think that's probably what the Hall of Fame will end up doing, is placing them on the ballot, giving them at least an opportunity to be voted in. But it will very much depend on the makeup of that committee and how they see things. There are a lot of players who are not happy with Pete Rose, including his own teammates and contemporaries, that they are not fans of his case for the Hall of Fame anymore. He spent many years lying, and that doesn't even include some of his off-field transgressions like statutory rape and tax evasion that put him in prison in the 1990s. So there's a lot of enemies that Pete Rose has made, and that's, his own fault. But it really depends on who's on that committee as to how seriously they will take his chances for the Hall of Fame. And same thing for Shoeless Joe.
And those committees do not meet every year, is the thing. They just met in 2024. That's why Dick Allen is in now. So if it's not 2027, then you're looking into 2030, and then it starts to become a thing, right? If depending on how that committee makes up, we do get voting totals from that committee, I believe, don't we? We get, if he's 1 vote short, okay, you can make that up the next time around. If he's 10 votes short, then it becomes a thing. Like I said, you mentioned new evidence, and you're the guy who does this. And by the way, you're watching a live stream with Jacob Pomrenke of Society for American Baseball Research. If you're watching, please put your questions in the chat. We'll try to answer them before we get out of here. You're the guy who's done the research. What do you think is the most impactful evidence that you've uncovered, or that researchers have uncovered in the last, say, 20, 25 years as it pertains to Jackson and the Sox?
Well, we published this project called 8 Myths Out,
which is
back
great,
in 2019 for the 100th anniversary of the World Series. And the 8 Myths Out project is available on the SABR website at sabr.org. And in that project, we put together a lot of the new evidence. And I mentioned the trial transcripts and the legal testimony. This is stuff that Elliot Asanoff, when he wrote the book 8 Men Out back in 1963, he did not have access to this stuff. He did not have access to the salary contract cards that are now at the Baseball Hall of Fame. Those got donated from the American League office in 2002, and so we now have salary information for these players. We have the transcripts. We now have film footage of the 1919 World Series that we didn't have. We had 5 minutes of game action from games 1 and game 3. So there's all kinds of new evidence that keeps coming out. We have interviews with the Black Sox, with the Clean Sox, and also with the Cincinnati Reds players. We have over 125 interviews that have surfaced thanks to newspapers being digitized. And so we have a better idea of how they felt, what they thought. To a man, the Cincinnati Reds players believed that they won that World Series fair and square back in 1919. And that, the White Sox, outside of game 1 and game 2, were trying pretty hard to win, and the Reds beat them fair and square, according to the Reds players. So there's, a lot of new evidence that's out there. We've compiled it all into some of our projects and some of our books with SABR. And, it's just, what else is coming out? It's hard to say. There might be a treasure trove of documents in somebody's attic somewhere that might come out, or some letters or correspondence from some of these players. I know the Fred McMullen, the utility infielder for the Black Sox, supposedly, according to his daughter-in-law, wrote up his own account, first-person account of the scandal. That's we have never seen before. Bill Veeck discovered a diary from the White Sox general manager, Harry Grabner. We know that diary does exist, but we don't know where it is anymore. So, we might start getting more of these first-person narratives, especially as the Hall of Fame discussion keeps going and the fire keeps burning about this whole story.
But for now, as of yesterday, the men you see in this photograph now, the 8 men who are out, are no longer 8 men out. they are no longer out. They are in, I mean, for what it's worth for them, for their families, have maybe some peace or some closure, something like that. But I don't know what that gets them, but at least there's no longer this huge stain on them. There's probably some residue, obviously, but their sentence, as it were, has ended as of yesterday. So that's moving forward. That's something that's interesting.
Yeah, this is, a big step. It really is. And, certainly the supporters and family of Joe Jackson in South Carolina and Buck Weaver in Chicago, have been fighting for this for many years. And they wanted to see Major League Baseball clear the players' names. I'm not sure that this announcement quite satisfied that.
Right.
Especially the fact that the Black Sox players were lumped in with Pete Rose and also, a bunch of other kind of random banned players from the 1920s.
I know, right? I didn't even
so-
know Benny Koff had been banned. I mean, I knew who Benny Koff was, but I didn't know he'd been banned.
Yeah, and he got banned for Grand Theft Auto,
Oh.
a trial for which he was acquitted in court. And Judge Landis said, "Well, you have poor character, so we're still going to kick you out of baseball."
Judge Landis was
had nothing to do with
not
the
a lot
Black
of
Sox
fun,
game.
not a lot of laughs in Judge Landis's court by any stretch of the imagination.
That's
Now, I
right.
know, SABR, you guys are doing a webinar next week with some experts as well. You're going to be moderating that. Give us a plug for that. Tell us people, if you're a SABR member, you probably already know because you heard about it today. But where can people go if they want to watch that and get more information?
Yeah, we just announced next Wednesday, May 21st, we'll have a webinar talking about Shoeless Joe, Pete Rose, the Hall of Fame, and just kind of all the implications of this week's big news. We'll be having Don Van Natta from ESPN, Jay Jaffe of Fangraphs, and Keith O'Brien, the author of Charlie Hustle, Pete Rose book that came out last year to great acclaim. So it'll be a really terrific discussion that's available. All SABR members can have access to the free Zoom webinar. We'll be sending the Zoom link to all SABR members next week. So if you're a SABR member, feel free to join us. And if you're not a SABR member, sign up before next Wednesday, and you'll get that in your email, and you'll have access to that and everything else that SABR offers.
Lots of good reasons to join SABR for sure. The book is called Scandal on the South Side. Jacob Pomrenke has been our guest, and he is one of the editors, the main editor of that book. I recommend it highly, again, especially topical now, and probably hopefully you see a surge in sales as people now rediscover some of the things that you have uncovered. I know 2019 was a big year because of the 100th anniversary, and with every new thing that happens, maybe a little bit more interest happens, but pick up the book. Jacob, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And the next time something big happens pertaining to this, we'll have you back on.
Always happy to talk baseball with you, Ken.
All right. Thanks, man. All right, folks. Thanks so much for joining us for our first ever live stream on this channel. Really appreciate you watching. Hopefully, give us a subscription. Subscribe to this channel. This is a channel. It's kind of eclectic. It has a lot of different things on it. Also got a new channel. Soccer Rewind is another channel that where we look at retro soccer. So if you like that, give that a tumble as well. But for now, I'm Ken Tomash. Thanks.